Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator today. Today, we're talking all about flavor, food, and how our perception of flavor is shaped not just by our tongues, but our past experiences as well. Joining us is Christopher Loss, a lecturer of food sciences in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Chris also happens to be the faculty author of our Culinary Science Essentials course, which can be found in the viewer chat there. So just open up there and you'll see that link. And just some quick housekeeping before we kind of delve into our conversation. We want our conversation to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to open that chat up again, like I mentioned, and submit some of your questions. We have reserved time during our conversation to answer some of them, and I promise we'll get to as many as we can. And with that out of the way, Chris, thank you so much for joining us for this keynote. It's really exciting to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. The opportunity to, as an educator and just as a person, to communicate with a diversity of people interested in food in any way is extremely valuable. And I greatly appreciate this opportunity. It's
Yeah,
a lot of fun.
really,
This is how you learn. You learn by communicating with people, you know.
very true, very true. I'm really looking forward to it. So I kind of want to baseline our conversation here. So in the title we mentioned, flavor perception and everything like that. So I'm wondering, what's the difference between flavor and taste?
Ah, this is a classic question, you know. I mean, there's the words themselves are different. But what we would say is from a sort of culinary science or food science perspective, especially under the subdiscipline of sensory evaluation and sensory science, flavor is an aggregate of sensory stimuli that is processed while you're eating. Taste is what happens on the tongue. Now, you say, well, when I put something on my tongue, I also touch it. So actually, taste involves touch and detection of things like sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, which is what we currently understand as the basic tastes. So taste is a little more reductive, or we might say it's just located. What happens when these basic stimuli, basic tastings, sweet, sour, salty, bitter compounds interact with receptors on our tongue, whereas flavor is really I mean, it's a very complicated thing. In many ways, it's a holy grail for those who study perception and consciousness, who want to understand what's going on while we're processing information. But flavor is the emergent effects when we, as a consumer, as a biological entity, interact with this extremely multimodal appearance, aromas, taste, textures. That's what flavor is both internal and external, put it that way, and still quite mysterious.
Very true. And you mentioned, our experiences as customers and consumers and, just animals as a whole. So I'm interested to know, why is it so important to our culinary experience to have both?
To have both what? Sorry,
Flavor and taste as well.
I see. I mean, there's actually some basic biological reasons. You know, taste is there, and there really some really strong research by anthropologists and developmental biologists, evolutionary biologists, who have clearly demonstrated that taste is there to detect something that's good, a nutrient that is useful. For example, sweet. We're born being able to detect sweetness even in lactose, or I should say, especially in lactose, as that is the primary sugar that we have when we're born, coming from our mother's milk. So there are those basic. We understand that taste has been sort of hardwired over time, forged through evolution and time, and preference to help us identify nutrients that are useful, whether they're sugars, amino acids, or things similar to that, and then also identify things that probably code for the response, spit this out because this is potentially toxic, or this is harmful to your body in some way. So,
and go for it, Chris.
So taste is really, it does have a very clear function in the area of identifying nutritional quality or properties of the foods we put in our mouths.
And I'd be interested to know, why are both so important, especially when we think about the culinary experience?
Right. Well, I mean, flavor, when you talk to any culinarian or you talk to a chef and cuisine experts, when they start to talk about flavor, the hands come up, it's hard to describe, but what is clear is that, people who work closely would know that flavor is sort of like the DNA of who you are and of your craft. If you understand your flavors and as I pointed out before, flavor is connected to the functionality of ingredients. It's connected to the tools and techniques you use to transform those things. It's connected to the consumers. If you understand flavor, then you also understand consumer. So it's important to chefs for that very basic reason, as it's a reflection of their artisan, capacity, their expertise and experiences. It's important to the food industry for similar reasons, based on we eat things that we like. And really, it's the most important assessment of flavor is enjoyment in many ways. And so understand and enjoyment is not just a single metric. It's all these combination of things that are very personal. So the food industry wants to understand flavor as an experience that people enjoy. And then, broadly in the research realm, I would say that flavor is important because it helps us understand how we process information. Flavor is a perception. Flavor is not a molecule that we find inside an orange and we can pull it out of the orange and say, here it is. Put this into this glass. Now you've got an orange in a glass. It never works that way. So it's very complicated how we process all this information. It just happens flavor is one of the most intimate, process interactions that we have with our environment. So it helps us understand, from a research standpoint, how we process information and that sort of thing. And even more so because we have entered, the realm of data science and systems thinking, especially in the transdisciplinary field of food science. Flavor is also a potential sort of measure or metric of sustainability, because it connects. We're going to have to address flavor as we address issues of changing our food systems to be more sustainable. For example, if we want people to eat the field of entomophagy, which is the preparation of bugs as food, which the majority of people around the world eat bugs. Even we do, and we don't even aware of it. But we're not going to be able to just take a plate of bugs and place them on the plates of consumers. Say, here you go. Instead of your juicy steak, now you can eat crickets. No, you have to understand the flavor. You have to understand the internal issues, the mindsets, and what we call the psychographics of consumers. How they perceive these things from the different attributes and utility of all these components of flavor, but also the internal aspects of what they value, their previous experiences, and this sort of thing. So that's why it's useful broadly to those interested in sustaining our food system in the long term.
And you mentioned, flavor being, an experience and not just simply taste. So I'd be interested to know, which one do we associate more with having an impact on our food experience? So for example, for me, I'm not a huge fan of beans, but depending on how they're cooked, I can, get them down easier than other times. So yes, is there one that we associate more with having a good food experience or a bad food experience?
You mean one sensory attribute or modality, as we say?
Yes.
Well, I would say so. If you had to create a hierarchy, very pragmatically, taste tells us if it's good or bad. So, if you had to be on an island, a deserted island, I probably, for survival, but that's not what you asked. You talked about the experience and the enjoyment. From that perspective, in my mind, it's a toss-up. Well, it's a toss-up between the aroma or olfactory properties of foods and the texture of foods. These are two things that are particularly dynamic and changing over time while you're perceiving the flavor. And there's that temporal quality, I think, keeps us engaged, and how it evolves and changes over the course of our meals, etc., is what we ultimately enjoy. And that last bite also should be enjoyable, right? Because if the coffee you get right before you leave the restaurant is bitter and cold, probably that's going to be the dominant sensory characteristic that begins to shape your experience. Something that I just want to point out about how we perceive that might also help us understand why flavor is important is that we detect, all of our senses, whether it's the eyes or the tongue or the ears, the nose, we detect differences. Our sensory systems are set up to detect. We don't detect when something stays the same. We detect differences. If something is painful, then we move. But something that doesn't irritate us a lot, it stays the same. It's called adaptation.
Mhm.
And so we're not as hardwired to detect harmony. And so there are interesting people who study ecology and psychology and philosophy of science that have suggested that this is one of the reasons why we muck up our environment, is because we don't see the harmonious aspects of it. Now, perhaps flavor is a good model to say, well, what is harmonious? When is harmony happening? Because it's not always easy to pick out. But you can say, this wine has a flaw and it's corked, or this cutlet is not as crispy. So we pick out the flaws. We're hardwired to do that, and it's for good reason. It's not something that humans just do. It's all sensory systems broadly do this.
Mhm. And you've mentioned a couple times that flavor really is kind of a sensory experience, like you said with the aromas, for example. But I'd be interested to know, what are some common misconceptions about the way we perceive certain flavors or flavors as a whole?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess the one that you sort of introduced initially is that, taste and flavor are somehow synonymous, you
Mhm.
know. But that would be one. The other is there's something that's referred to as a taste map, or a tongue map, that many
Mhm.
of us learned of, where they say, okay, you taste salty on this part of your tongue, sweet on this part of your tongue, sour and bitter, and etc. Um, and that is a misinformation. It was a piece of data that was sort of taken out of context years ago. In fact, our tongues don't work like that. Going model by Chandrasekhar and others out in California, I don't know how long ago, maybe from 2000s, they came up with a model that kind of clearly showed that anywhere that there is a taste bud, you can detect all different types of tastes, because a taste bud, if you stick out your tongue and look at the little bumps, those bumps are papillae. They're not taste buds. Actually, inside those bumps are a whole bunch of taste buds, and each of those buds is a family of receptors that are intertwined together, reaching out sort of into the oral cavity. I mean, so to speak, reaching out to sort of waiting for soluble compounds like sugars and salts and bitter compounds or whatever.
Mm.
Um, so everywhere around the tongue, the current going model is that there are the ability to taste every possible taste, except and this is in humans, of course. There are other animals that can't taste things, certain proteins, they can't taste umami and savory. But
Mhm.
the center of the tongue, if you look at your tongue in the mirror, you'll see a little crease down the center of your tongue. That
Mhm.
little crease contains no taste buds. So if you wanted to actually
Oh.
not taste something, but feel it, and you placed with, maybe a pair of tweezers or something, a little crystal of salt or sugar on the middle of your tongue, you would feel it, but probably not taste it until quickly saliva dissolved it and dispersed it onto other areas of the tongue.
Mm.
So I would say that the tongue map has been sort of is not useful model anymore. It used to be interesting to look at. That
Mhm.
said, and this is why science is great, because it always keeps us guessing, there is evidence that with training, you can discern temporal qualities. You can discern different qualities in different areas of the tongue simultaneously, because you've trained yourself. So chefs will say, I taste bitterness here and there, and it may well be that there are a concentration of bitterness receptors towards the back, or that are there to ensure that there aren't any sort of poisonous compounds, sort of thing.
Mhm.
But it's the research, like I said, that suggested this was just a suggestion, and also it was demonstrated under conditions that we never encounter in real food.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
one of the things I have to say about culinary science, is that we try to do things in context. We want to understand what it's like, because the experience of taking it, although experience of doing a taste test in a sensory booth,
Mhm.
it is interesting and important and useful. But when we're talking to people and the questions that you have, you say, "What am I experiencing now?" Whether it's at the five-star, Michelin restaurant, or
Mhm.
at the Knish, cart, in Central Park, sort of thing. Um,
That's
I would say other misconceptions, that's a long one for one misconception, is that there is a good or bad taste. I mean, we all know that taste is individual, but whenever someone says, I know the best flavor for something, I
Mhm.
always I ask, what is the best and for who, for whom?
Okay.
And maybe it's thought that we all taste, there's a certain ability to taste that we all have the capacity of.
Mhm.
And that some do it better than others, but that's not the case. I love this expression. Comes from the psychophysicists and sensory scientists and geneticists who have looked at this area of flavor. We all live in our own flavor worlds. Flavor is very diverse. So one, no one perceives exactly the same thing. And two, whatever we call the hedonic valence or the enjoyment factor is
Mhm.
extremely individual. Now we can group them based on, averages and ranges of experience, but in the end, we all are having very individual experiences. And the genetic code that is, has all the information for the receptors that help us interpret flavor as we're consuming. There's a family of receptors, and these, they break the genome into different families. Makes it easier to talk about it. Genome for hair color, genome for various organ development, all this different thing. And there's one called the gene family for the flavor genome, and largely built with on aroma receptors, olfactory receptors, but
Mhm.
it's the largest family in the genome. It's also the most diverse family. So we all perceive very, very differently. So when people tell you, "Oh, this is how it should be," you can always ask how, why, what is it about that makes it so good? What's important is Spock said on Star Trek, it's our differences, it's our similarities that bring us together, but our differences that make us interesting. And there are similarities, there are basic patterns, but it's the diversity of flavor perception that is really valuable and for us to begin to recognize,
That's so interesting. It's so interesting to think about. And I'm just kind of thinking now about how me and my wife perceive different flavors. So, she loves acidic foods. I'm kind of on the fence about it. If something's too acidic, I'll let her know. But she's like, perfect. It's perfect for me. So it's so interesting. But we actually just got a really interesting audience question in, and you had mentioned a little bit about, some of these food manufacturers and sustainability and all that work. So Tumelo actually asked, what is the future impact of climate change on food taste? So will climate change affect how we taste food and everything like that?
I mean, the answer is yes. Now, if we're talking about taste, just to go back to our definitions, if we're talking about, the basic taste ins like sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, yes, there are many compounds that contribute to that,
Mhm.
and agricultural practices influence the concentration of these things, post-harvest processing as well. But if we're talking about taste and flavor broadly, and because flavor is multimodal, if you pull on taste, you may affect aroma. You know what I'm saying? You pull on, there are all sorts of weird, what we call top-down or peripheral effects salt gives. Doesn't only taste salty, but it also can be sweet at very low levels. Or salt can create body in liquids and things. So my answer is yes. Whether you're talking about taste or flavor, definitely agricultural practices will affect it. There are some examples. I mean, I think that's actually what was the name of the participant?
Tumelo, and I
Mello.
apologize.
Tumelo is, I mean, really, this is in many ways the gazillion-dollar question. Is we want to understand, though, it's not where we are right now, although we are here and we can measure what's going on, our interactions with our food system, but it's how these changes come to light. The mechanisms that underlie changes and changes in nutrition in the crops and consumers' preferences for those things. But there's an example in the area of tea production. Now, in Japan and China, tea is extremely important. It's been around for some time, and there are practices in preparing what matcha is a popular tea beverage. I don't know if any folks have heard of matcha, but I've been working on a project with some folks on it, and I've been learning about matcha production. They have agricultural practices that affect flavor specifically, and at the same time help them adapt to the environmental changes going on, like let's say global warming. There's a shading process during the preparation of these teas. So maybe a month before they're harvested or weeks or whatever it is, they put a shade over the plants. It changes the flavor quality. Initially, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to mellow out certain flavor tastings and mouthfeel effects by minimizing photosynthesis, by
Mhm.
shading the sun. The technique was originally there because it would protect from frost in the winter.
Mhm.
So now there's these, so to me, it's like, there was a technique that was being used to, for the totally different reason, the temperature change. Okay, now we got to change the flavor quality by mitigating, the sunlight and controlling the growth. So I
Mhm.
think, and those are artisans that over thousands of years have sort of developed these sort of
Mhm.
practices. You
Mhm.
can say the same thing about fermented products as well, because they're
Mhm.
they're uh, a more systematic sort of preservation technique.
Mhm.
But yeah, you'll see there more and more people are breeding plants for flavor rather than for, let's say, the stability over transport and things like that. So I see that's also a sort of nod to climate change in that we developed products, agricultural products were bred for stability and longevity and shipment and these sorts of things, but things have changed. And we have a system, distribution system where we can grow things local, maybe because of climate change. Maybe more people will be growing things in these warmer climates, and in which case, that could affect it as well.
Mhm.
Um, but absolutely, the cuisines also are how we learn about different climates, and we gain nutritional quality from our food, and we go to these places. These places are changing. They want to preserve Mediterranean cuisine. Sorry, I'm slouching.
Mhm.
Mediterranean cuisine, for example, and that's evolving too, and becoming mingled up through international travel, and the sort of the beneficial properties of the sort of it are being diluted, let's say, to some degree, which is all the reason why people want to document them and better understand ingredients, how they function, and best as possible how to create
Mhm.
those sort of flavors. So taste, flavor, texture,
Mhm.
all these attributes can be impacted by breeding and plant breeding and the agricultural process pre and post harvest. Warmer
And
climate. Go ahead.
And you touched on this a little bit with your, matcha and the shade example. And Hannah just had a quick follow up on that. She wanted to know, can you elaborate on your point about how humans don't detect harmony very well and how this has influenced our current sustainability issues in the food industry? So you touched on this a little bit with the
Yeah, yeah.
matcha example.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, and again, that's not my creation. There are folks. I'm trying to think of the people worth noting there. Citing Gregory Bateson is someone if you want to look up, who was a sort of protean academic, and folks can check him out. But he's the one who sort of identified that idea that harmony in our ecosystems are strength. What he said is our ecosystems are strengthened by the delicate balances and interactions within the system.
Mhm.
And it's not that there's a silver bullet protection that an ecosystem has. And E.O. Wilson at Harvard, who was an evolutionary biologist, said the same thing. He wrote a book called Diversity. I think it was called Diversity. I forget the name of it. But and the point is that it's those interdependencies, it's those interactions that give strength and vitality. And I think flavor is the same way. There's lots of interdependencies, interactions between flavor that reflect harmony. Now, and so that's probably why it's easier to make a bad flavor. Everyone can tell you about their failed flavors, and then you get these things once in a while that are really good. So my point is that it's a our sensory systems
Mhm.
seem to be set up to not pick out what's
Mhm.
working, but to notice it when we've kind of trudged over it and destroyed it.
Mhm.
And then we have to rebuild it because we see something's wrong. So I think flavors are a good example or model to look at that. Now, how can we exactly use that to address issues of sustainability? I mean, I don't have the answer to that exactly, but I would say, you know, perception follows attention is one of the sort of axioms of flavor research. And
Mhm.
I think if we attend to these harmonies, maybe we'll be able to perceive them. Maybe we'll be able to see where plant breeding and the need to provide nutrient-dense ingredients to those who are, let's say, in underserved communities,
Mhm.
There's a balance somewhere in there. There's an opportunity because there's an incongruence and there's an opportunity to sort of figure out how to balance these things out. So I guess that's where I'm going with that issue of sustainability. And yeah.
Perfect. Hannah, I hope we answered your question. But kind of, back to what we were talking a little bit about before regarding, kind of how flavor is, there's a wide range that goes into how we perceive flavor. I'd be interested to know, taking it, kind of 3,000 feet up and looking at it very broadly, what factors influence our perception of flavor the most, would you say?
Well, we break them. There are many because it's this sort of intertwining of information.
Hmm.
So many factors. So we break when in science when we have things that are complicated in this way, we break it down into categories. So we have intrinsic and extrinsic. Is that perfect way of looking at it? No, but it's a good way of breaking it down. So extrinsic factors are things outside and around you, things you can't control.
Hmm.
If you go into a diner and they just cleaned the table with bleach.
Hmm.
And you smell that bleach, and then you sit down and you order. Maybe for you that says, oh, I'm in a clean place. Depends what diner you go to. You may be thrilled to smell the bleach in something. But
Hmm.
or other times I said, oh, something just clean, there's something dirty. I think I'm in a bathroom, and that could prime your senses. That's something you have no control over. Okay.
Hmm.
So that's an example of an external factor. The people that you're with, that you're sharing this experience with, are external
Hmm.
factors. And then there are the food it itself is an external factor until you eat it, right? And then inside your mouth, you can't. That's one of the things of why flavor is complicated. You can't share it with everybody. You and I could watch a movie, look at a painting. We could listen to a jazz concert and then
Hmm.
talk about it. But I can't share, in any sanitary way, my food with you, and I shoot a
Sure.
little. Everyone's mouths are different. We can take it off the same plate, but in
Hmm.
our mouths, there's vast diversity of the quality, quantity, composition of saliva. The enzymatic composition varies wildly from person to person, or the physiology of the oral cavity. So those are internal factors, things in the food, things within the person, the genetic diversity of the person, the ability of the person to even detect certain compounds. There's something called anosmia, which is when some people either can't smell anything, or there's specific anosmias where they can't smell grape, or they can't smell musty, or they can't smell peppery, and things like this. Um, so those are intrinsic factors as well. So you break them down to those two categories, and you got the extrinsic and the intrinsic. If let's say, even smelling an aroma, it's whatever's around you. You don't just smell the food. You smell the person with the perfume. You smell nowadays in New York City, they got these, because of COVID, they got all these restaurants,
Hmm.
outside on the street, which personally is not the context. I mean, there's gigantic buses rolling by. You're basically right by this exhaust. But the restaurant industry definitely it benefits and needs that opportunity. Um, but those things are some you control, some that you can't. What you can control, and I think influences flavor perception, is what I mentioned before, is attention,
Hmm.
attending to what you're perceiving when you're eating it. And it's amazing what you can pick out in
Hmm.
something as simple as water, or as I would say, as complex as even milk. A glass of milk is extremely complicated.
Hmm.
But over the last couple of weeks, I was doing some sensory testing with water, and it's a complicated because of its minimal sort of properties. It's not vastly colorful. It's not heterogeneous in any way, but it's not pure, and neither are each of our palates. So these are these factors uh, are all always at play. So I think that one thing that you can control is attention. And when we're eating, I think it's worthwhile attending to the flavors and thinking about how sweet is that, how salty is that. You don't have to make an academic exercise,
Hmm.
out of every meal, or a massive, objective exploration. But
Hmm.
in many ways, it's a type of meditation to some people. When you can, I mean, definitely people talk about cooking relaxing them. I think
Hmm.
there is a sensory aspect of that, about controlling your environment and seeing something transform. But also, when we're eating, we are transforming and having this very intimate interaction. And I think, there's opportunity to learn from that.
Hmm.
And as we say, because we all live in our own flavor worlds, we actually learn not just about our environment, but we can learn about ourselves when we reflect on the flavors we perceive and then discuss them with other people, because that's what's important is talking to other people about starting a dialogue.
Mhm. And you talk a little bit about the extrinsic and intrinsic factors. So I'd be interested to know, how do these two factors interact with each other? So you brought up the example of, waiter, waitress, just, put some bleach on the table. So how do
Right,
these
right,
two
right.
things
Oh
interact
yeah,
with
there's
each other?
many interactions, and that's these are called. There are a variety of different categories of these interactions, but let's just they're multimodal interactions or cross-modal interactions. Um, Another example, very popular example, is the color of things. These are visual external things. The color makes me think it's going to be a certain flavor or an intensity of sweetness or a certain fruit. I haven't even touched the thing yet, but these light rays bouncing off of this cup are are influencing the perception of taste intensity, the perception of what it is, its identity. That's an external thing. I mean, I can say uh, and aesthetics, for example. Actually, it's something I did some research on when I was at the CIA at the Culinary Institute of America, and
Mhm.
we worked with chefs and experimental psychologists to look at how the plating and the aesthetic of the
Mhm.
plating, which is also external, uh, how that affects liking for the different foods people consume. And we found that you can increase liking if you have a certain aesthetic appeal of things like brown rice and chicken with the Fiend's herb sauce and some almonds. Uh, what we couldn't affect in at least in this particular experimental setup and design, we couldn't move the needle of green beans. So
Mhm.
we had beautiful, we had one that they were both, interesting, and one was perceived as more aesthetically appealing. And the items, for the large part, were more liked. And
Mhm.
I forget if people would pay more, but they thought there was, better quality.
Mhm.
But the green bean effect, kept us guessing. So, but there's lots of work out there about working with vegetables and how you can present them to make them more appealing. But yeah, that would be another example. I would say if I want to find one where I want to find one where to think of emotion, and state of mind. Um, you know, I mean, for sure, if you are, it just follows by perception following attention that if you're attending, let's say you had an argument with somebody and you're sitting at
Mhm.
the table and you have to sit through this meal and you're thinking of this argument and either why you had it or you shouldn't have had
Mhm.
it, or it's still under resolved. That is prominent. That is going to dominate your sensory, your flavor experience. And in that circumstance, I would say that flavors, generally speaking, are going to be muted. Perhaps, flaws will come out more easily because you will be looking for flaws and primed to find something that is wrong or negative. Um, but yeah, and there's many. I mean, there's all sorts of work on the auditory cues that we get with food or from food and flavor. So the sensory and the auditory environment, if it's congruous or incongruous with the food or theme, it can affect enjoyment. That's been demonstrated definitely by Charles Spence, who's at University of Oxford, who's done a lot of work in that area. The crinkling of packages. There was a more sustainable package that some chip company had, and it was made out of material that broke down very quick and very easily.
Mhm.
But the package was so darn noisy that it turned people off to their chips, and so they
Mhm.
had to go back to something else or design it to make it a little softer.
Mhm.
People pick up on amazing details. There used to be a company that made cranberry jelly, and it was something very popular and common, almost a heritage sort of brand and and um, component of a Thanksgiving dinner in the U.S.
Mhm.
And it was on a can, and the can had gelled cranberry in it, and you'd open up the can, you stick it on the bowl, and you slice it, and people came to love it. Like I said, it was there forever. And then one time, and so the shape of the can, it has like these three ribs. If you look at the side of the can, sometimes
Mhm.
cans for processing reason have these little ribs, and they move them around. And they changed the can configuration. It had two ribs instead of five little ribs.
Wow.
The flavor changed. Here's a simply they're like, where's my old stuff? So we pick up on these things. So somehow over time that contributed to the harmony or the identity or acceptance of this relatively simple item. So then, you know, look at fine dining and the experiences that they create. So much of
Mhm.
what we do and what's done in fine dining is to create context, to create an experience that is above and beyond the plate.
Mhm.
Um, I was fortunate to go to a restaurant called Alinea not too long ago, and it's a fine dining sort of place, very experiential, almost like a theater experience. And
Mhm.
one of the courses, or two of the courses, were served in the kitchen. And so, I mean, that totally affected the flavor. I mean,
Mhm.
what is happening? If you can't describe the flavor without describing the context.
Mhm.
And so, definitely, chefs know that we're all dealing with the same stuff.
Mhm.
So we got all, I mean, you can get good quality ingredients, variety, diversity of ingredients, and that's always increasing, which is a need, why there's a need for a culinary science sort of perspective. We have a diversity of ingredients. Click a button, and tomorrow, from the other side of the world, there's some herb you never heard of that makes your tongue tingle and then pop. You can have it, and you got to figure out how to work with it. Or is it safe, or what are its origins and functionality, and what happens when I cook it, sort of thing.
Mhm. And now that we're thinking about some of the different ways that we perceive, flavor, not just, taste, but like you said, like in New York City, if there's a bus going by, or, your experience eating in the kitchen, um, we just got a really interesting question in from Elizabeth, kind of
Yeah,
along this same line.
definitely.
So Elizabeth wanted to know, does flavor perception differ between children and adults? And how does flavor perception change as we age? So I know for me, for example, I really like spicy food. My parents don't. They just, grew up not really eating spicy food. So how does that work?
Right. Exactly how it works is the unsatisfying. It's not entirely known. But what are the patterns that we do? For sure, well, to answer directly, yes, it is different when you're developing. Uh, there are memories. The turnover. So when we're very young, as we're developing, the turnover, your diet actually, even let's go back into the womb. The diet, it's been demonstrated by folks at Monell and other sensory research groups that the diet of the mother affects the perception and preferences of the child. Now these studies are hard to do, so it's usually a small n, and you can't be too broad. But there seems to be a clear connection between what the mother eats. There is definitely a connection between what the mother eats and the unborn child's preferences, and then their behaviors after they're born. We also know that when you're young, your taste buds and your receptors turn over quicker than when you're older. Now, this is important because you got to have good, when you're young, learning. No, you don't want to eat that batter. You don't want to eat that, disgusting thing. You got to you got to be ready. So we haven't learned a lot. We need to constantly learn.
Mhm.
So taste buds, the proteins that are coded in our genes and the receptors for taste buds and for aroma receptors and others turn over much more quickly when we're young. As we get old, that turnover slows down.
Mhm.
As we get old, however, the general perception is, oh, sensory acuity of elders is less than people who are young.
Mhm.
And it often goes to olfaction, a sense of smell is less, um, or sense of taste has gone down, or the ability to recall flavors. What is clear is, yes, receptors turnover slows down.
Mhm.
So you might perceive an acuity, a decrease in acuity of sensory perception in certain basic tastes in elders or certain aromas. However, their overall flavor lexicon and ability to articulate flavors of people who've been around, older people, that's improved. So I can't articulate as a younger person what I've done, but when
Mhm.
I'm older, I can pull out, there's a greater overall experience to draw from. I call it the Rolodex of sensory of flavor, So
Mhm.
that somehow balances things out. But
Mhm.
for sure, there could be challenges as we get old in sort of adapting our sensory our cooking techniques. Also because of medications we take. Another reason I didn't mention, but in the area of the importance of understanding flavor in the area of health and wellness is when people have uh, cancer treatment, their taste buds go wackadoo, and their sense of smell go crazy because of the types of treatments are harmful to that. And so if we understand flavor, we can figure out how to design meals that they find acceptable. And the way that we're going to do that is understand flavor perception because it's not a formulation thing. Um, so um, So yes, there are differences in our perception when we're young, we're old. There are differences in males and females. Females have been there's some work goes back like 60 years that shows that women have greater sensory acuity in olfaction than do males. Um, One thing that just to say about as we get older, uh, well, when we're younger and we're developing, it's been also demonstrated that being exposed to lots of sensory experiences can facilitate learning. So, food as a medium and I think flavor, essentially when it comes down to it, flavor is information and it's a medium, a valuable medium for learning. And so exposing children when they're developing to lots of different flavors, I think, is not just about nutrition, although I think it's been demonstrated to be valuable for nutrition education. It's also just good learning, broad sort of learning of bringing together different aspects of the physical, chemical, psychological world we live in. Adults adults have developed these flavors. We learn a lot. We can learn to adapt. That's something that we should think of. You can learn. We're only born liking sweetness, but saltiness we're not. People think, oh, salty is hardwired. No, you can if you have a sodium issue and or see coronary heart disease or something where you have to pull back on your sodium. You can learn to taste salt much by pulling back and just stop. And it takes a little time, takes a little patience, it takes attention, attending to that. But that's something that you can do. In the elder population, people are living longer. I've done focus groups and sensory testing with consumers across the country. This was years ago, but to understand how to optimize senior living facilities and assisted living where their food is. Turns out their sensory experiences, their flavor experience, are some of the most important aspects of their day. They get together, they socialize. Their health and wellness is directly connected to this, and so understanding and what was interesting when we worked with seniors is that the sensory properties exactly of the food were not so important. There were nutritional aspects, but it was the social context, and they liked flavors. They liked to talk about it. At least amongst this group, it's fairly consistent observation. But it was a very important socializing opportunity on a daily basis. That there was a type of exercise, cognitive exercise, and so that's all the good reason to understand flavor of foods. Because in the past, especially for elders, because in the past they just pureed things up and said, okay, here's your steak, spin it out and give it to your straw, which is disgusting. I mean, when it comes down to it, and insulting. But elders now are not just older; they're also their wallets have followed them and grown over time, and they have a say, and they want better food. So I think there's good reason to know that as well.
That's very true. And you mentioned a little bit about, if somebody has, coronary heart disease or something like that, and they can't really do a lot of salt. I'd be interested to know what's the science behind, flavor enhancement. So such as, the use of umami or certain kind of cooking techniques.
Yes. Uh, Again, it's contextual. There is definitely flavor potentiators that are out there.
Hmm.
What in biological systems, especially in food, typically when things come together, they mute each other and create something new. Not always when things come together do they accentuate one or the other. More of a what we call mixture suppression rather than, like you said, enhancement or potentiation. And these are two different terms that, not to get technical, but enhancement is to increase liking for something. Potentiation is to increase the intensity of something. So, if you have a health issue that is connected to high sodium content and you can't stand the taste of salt, then removing salt is not going to do much for you. But if you know that you have salt, in your diet, then understanding flavor can be very important to that. And then thinking about how can you potentiate these things? Well, you can, in the case of salt, they've been looking at those things for years. Since the late 40s, they've been saying, hey, there's too much salt in our diet. They've been saying for a long time. And they've done research, and we know that you can go on low salt diets. You can detect sodium, as I was mentioning. You can be more attentive to saltiness in your foods and think of where it's coming from and begin to pull back on it. But potentiation is something that, for example, with salt, I've seen a variety of ways that people address a way of enhancing saltiness. And again, these depend upon the food systems you're working in.
Mhm.
So you can't apply what you would do in a soup with what you might do in a hamburger, for example.
Oh,
All
yeah.
right. But let's just look at a soup because it's a relatively simple system. You can use glutamates, which is the amino acid that is underlying the umami quality of foods, which is that sort of savory, yummy, long-lasting, mouthful quality of foods that comes from proteins, certain proteins, and all glutamate in particular, but also comes from small pieces of genetic material that are found in all cells called, for example, 5' phosphates. So, in particular, something called inosine monophosphate. And this little piece, together with glutamate, can really amplify umami quality, and together with certain herbs, let's say bay leaf, rosemary, can enhance perceived saltiness. You could also prime the senses by saying, "This is very salty. What's coming?" Or depending. There's other ways of going about it. But so that's an example of enhancing saltiness, either using a potentiator like glutamates or inosine monophosphate in a liquid system, together with aromatics. I would, because in soups, if you have an incongruous aromatic, for example, if you had a soup and you put in a warm spice like cinnamon or something like that, or something associated with sweet baked spice, people might think it's kind of sweet because of the aroma, potentially something in the mouth feel, right? So those are things you need to think about, and understanding of flavor help you do that. Another way that is not thought of is the effects of temperature in model systems. I do have a slide for this, but we were just talking, it's fine. In model systems, it's been demonstrated that different tastings have different intensities at different temperatures. As a culinarian, I was taught when it's warmer, everything's more enhanced. And when it's colder, everything's muted. That's not the case if you look at individual tastings. Something that is salty is more intense when it's cool than when it's warm. So same amount of salt, cool it down, it's going to be more salty. So we haven't really looked at ways to control temperature. Now, this is done in a model system. When you combine it into a stew or a soup or a roast, and it gets complicated. But this has been, and it hasn't been explored in more, what I would say in more practical systems, in models. So those are things that need to be looked at. How the temperature of foods affect taste intensity. And also, when it comes to seasoning, I have to find this reference, but something like 80% of the salt you put, I remember reading, in your mashed potatoes, doesn't interact with your taste buds at all. A very small percentage actually interact, and with most foods, that's the case. Not every, you don't chew every bit of food until it's homogeneous and then constantly flow it over your tongue. You chomp, 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 chomp. Some people take big bites, whatever. But a small percentage of that salt interacts with our palate. So one time I did some work a while ago, and there's been other research to sort of back this. The effects of seasoning, for example, salt. Where is the sensory attribute? Where's the sensory, where's the thing being perceived physically in the product? And when you season on the surface, for example, you can reduce salt by seasoning on the surface and taking salt out of the matrix. So, excuse me. And so that's another example of how you might address saltiness. And a lot of these have been, demonstrated, but not fully tested in a variety of foods.
That's so interesting. And I'd be interested to know kind of along these similar lines, we're talking about, different factors when it comes to enhancing flavor, making certain flavors more intense. Share checks in with an interesting question along these lines. So they wanted to know, are there eating recommendations to optimize flavor as well? So like wine tasting has certain steps that you have to do to really bring out the flavor. Is there a similar approach with respect to food tasting, essentially?
Well, I mean, there isn't a defined, method out there in the same way that you have sommeliers. There are also so that really many of these experts follow commodities, and then when you bring things together, it gets complicated. That said, I think a chef who designs a meal, for example, a tasting meal, and has in some way wants to imbue the food and flavor, his ideas in the food and flavors, and they suggest a way of eating, I think that's very legitimate, because someone with that in mind said, I want you to have something crispy, then something warm, and then something soft, and then some,
Mhm.
aromatic or whatever. So in those cases, there is someone can prescribe for the purposes of understanding holistically, what that, the whole flavor experience is going to be. As far as generally speaking, I would say what I would say is this idea of attention. Attend to what you're eating when you're eating it, and
Mhm.
you will learn a lot. And then you will learn what you like and what you don't like, how to talk to people about that.
Mhm.
But I would personally never prescribe a certain way of eating. Um, uh,
Mhm.
you know, I'm reading a book now just because I'm trying to get through this book on the evolution of the human head. I saw it and it was recommended by somebody, some of these books. I got to read this. And it can be very interesting, but also at times it can be very detailed and boring. It has good beginnings. But anyway, but one thing that in this book that I saw that sort of struck me in connected to this is that
Mhm.
yes, the more that you chew and the more that you increase the surface area, the more that information you get out of the food that you're eating.
Mhm.
So there have been recommendations back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where people had recommendations. I think there was something. There was a whole the Kellogg folks, and not to mention a company, but there were researchers. I have found an old book of the process of nutrition back then. And there were recommendations: chew this many times. Eat these
Oh,
sorts of
wow.
foods. I would say that given the what did Richie Cunningham say on eat 38, chew 32 times to avoid any danger, then you get to watch the Lone Ranger. You can there are sort of tales and approaches, but I think that chewing your food thoroughly,
Mhm.
only good things come out of that. Only good things. First of all, you break down, you pre-digest. Every food needs to be, into some degree, exodigested before it actually gets into the gut. Increasing surface area, enzymatic activity in the mouth, homogeneity of what we call eventually the bolus and chyme that goes down our into our digestive tract. You're going to extract more efficiently. You're going to get more out of the flavor. You're going to get more flavor out of it because you'll be able to detect more as it resides in the oral cavity. So I mean that would be my recommendation. Um, but for people who there are pathologies that people have with eating, problems swallowing, problems with rejection of certain types of or reaction to certain types of um, uh, fiber that will
Mhm.
impact the motility of your GI tract. And these are things that are directly associated with flavor for people. And so trying to understand that and how to modify recipes to make the flavor enjoyable and physiologically feasible is also maybe where guidelines in eating come into play.
Mhm.
And also say only other time I tell people how to consume things is in sensory tests, which we do focus in this class about sensory evaluation and what are the tools and techniques that have been developed in the realm of science
Mhm.
to understand all this complexity, this diversity,
Mhm.
this variety and opportunity for the industry and the food system broadly.
Mhm.
Um, there is definitely uh, uh, need for all of those for studying. I'm sorry, I lost my track. Sensory evaluation, the subdiscipline of food science, prescribes exactly how to sample foods and beverages and whatever it is, even using a fork. You might use sensory techniques to assess that, evaluate that experience. In those cases, when we're under research circumstances, um, we tell people exactly what to do, because we want to control for various factors.
Of course.
Sample from left to right. Make sure that there's, counterbalance samples, and these are things again we talk about in the class
Mhm.
that we have to be reductive sometimes. We can't always just say, "Oh, let's have a meal and we'll talk to people." You get rich information, but then you got to tweeze
Mhm.
apart all the differences and similarities that are not so easy to tweeze apart because you designed a contextual experiment.
Of course. And with that, you talked a little bit about the science. So I just real quickly wanted to touch on this question from Robert. Robert asks, We use chemicals and additives to make flavors taste like natural foods. Does this change our perception of how we taste? As a whole, is it more beneficial to stay away from foods with high chemical flavoring agents?
Right. Well, there's natural. I mean, the term natural to food scientists and to the food regulatory industry, natural. All foods are natural, so to speak. There are regulatory. I'm trying to define exactly what natural means is difficult. There are natural sources, and from a food scientist perspective, uh, all foods are. This is the most unromantic way of talking about food. I'll just preface. Foods are edible biochemicals.
Hmm.
Some of those biochemicals, and this is something else I wanted to bring up that's good primer for this class, is
Hmm.
some of those biochemicals are organic, some of those biochemicals are inorganic. We often think organic's better than inorganic,
Hmm.
but foods are comprised of organic and inorganic constituents.
Hmm.
Um, so when we say better, we again, I got to come back to we look at food quality and food safety. We can be objective about food safety. When it comes to quality, we got to put it into context. Um, there's no evidence that I'm aware of that the tastes of these flavor enhancers, functional ingredients like flavorings that are usually distillates from something in the natural world or something that's been slightly modified from that world. There are stabilizers that affect emulsion texture, some of which come from nature, like we find naturally in in a in whole wheat, or that we find in a lily pad somewhere that someone extracts. There's all sorts of these compounds. They're edible biochemicals. Uh, I haven't seen research or evidence that suggests that if they come from one source or another, whether it's organic or inorganic, whether it's considered natural or not,
Hmm.
that it has a negative or positive impact on your perception of taste and your health and well-being.
Hmm.
That said, I do think that a diversity in diet and a diversity of sensory experiences is healthier than a homogeneous one. And what is, for example, a flavor, a strawberry extract that is a flavor used in, let's say, a strawberry ice cream. The
Okay.
reason why the industry is using a strawberry, it's if it makes it possible to make a consistent flavor year round. Okay,
Hmm.
and we eat with our memories. So you have the strawberry ice cream. Do you want a strawberry ice cream that always tastes like that delicious picked when it's ripe? Then they're going to do something to make it, because the strawberries they picked, you can't pick strawberries everywhere in December, but you can in perhaps in Guatemala and etc. And so, but those agricultural products are going to vary dramatically. And so they modify the ice cream with strawberries that's been puree that's been modified, baby flavor's been added to that. Then they modify their ice cream to add a little more. And the idea is to create a consistent experience, because we do eat with our memories, and you want to get that ice cream.
Hmm.
However, like I said, I think that from a flavor and education and enjoyment standpoint, personally, and I think from what I see in the research, a diversity in diet. It's not just that you eat a lot of macro and micronutrients. It's that these things have a variety of colors, a variety of aromas, a variety of textures, a variety of flavors. We enjoy this. It is the
Hmm.
omnivore's dilemma, as folks have described, which actually originally came from the psychological literature and Paul Rozin and Harry Lawless, that
Hmm.
we can eat everything. So now we have the chance to eat things that are not good for us. So we got to that
Hmm.
comes along with a burden. We can try almost everything. We should explore these things. They help us learn about other cultures. They help us learn about our environment. They help us learn about ourselves. So I would recommend a diverse diet. How you go about eating it? You want to have breakfast at midnight and you want to have dessert at the beginning? Hey, I think those are things you all have. You're at liberty to do and to try and to see what happens.
That's perfect. And Chris, before you leave us, I want to know what's one thing you would want us to know, reach out to the audience, give us one thing to think about as we're, preparing to cook lunch or dinner this evening, and think about, kind of some of the flavors we're going to incorporate, and, obviously cooking for, family, friends, everything. What's that one thing you would want us to know when we're thinking about what we're cooking and the flavor that it brings?
Huh. Well, I mean, there's many things that are happening, and then so
Mhm.
it's hard to say that there's nothing that is going to entirely minimize risk. You go into to cook something, and you buy a fish that was a little more expensive and you make a mistake. And now you're like, oh, I'm not going to do that. So, I mean, there's a reluctance that happens because you make, so there's good reason. One thing, the two things. One thing is to recognize when you go into a recipe is a model. It is not a, didn't come, it's a model for how to get ingredients to interact with each other to create what we perceive as flavors. And as we say in science, and anyone who's cooked and followed a recipe once or twice knows that all models are wrong. They're wrong, but some are more useful than others. That's what makes a good recipe. It includes the useful information to getting these things to interact. So one is expectations as you come in. Your intentions coming into cooking is to recognize that whatever you're using did not come from come through some magical membrane and is perfect, and will answer all your problems or address all your problems. The other thing, so have that expectation. The other thing related to that is be ready to explore. Be ready to make mistakes and to learn. I mean, so many people want to be a great cook. There's so many analogies and turns of phrase, that, you got to break some eggs to make an omelet. This is the fact, you got to burn a couple things, and what is it that I don't like? What do I do like about burning? Why didn't I just wait? So I would say be exploratory, be attentive. I can't say one thing. Be exploratory, be attentive, and one other secret ingredient I would say, being prepared. At culinary school and people who work in restaurants know all about mise en place. I could very easily have said, what's the most important thing? The concept of mise en place, which is that have everything in its place before you start going. That includes physical and mental. Where are my ingredients? Don't start and then have to go to the supermarket and go get your flour. I mean, I'd want to say that that's common sense. You definitely want to be prepared and organized, but being ready. And that prepares you for the unexpected. As there's a good quote by Louis Pasteur: "Chance favors the prepared mind." So you may be cooking and be prepared, and you make a mistake, but you understood what the mistake was, and now you recreate it, and you just came up with something quite amazing, or something novel, something different. So there are a variety of things, but just be open to experiencing something new, I would say, and having some humility, and accept that you're not going to be perfect. All chefs recognize that it's very difficult to articulate flavors. Even that's why sommeliers go through training like this. That's why people who cup coffee go through extensive training. And even then, there are gas chromatographs that can sort of tell them with greater, a piece of equipment that can say, that there's get more granular than they are. You can't talk about the emotion. It can't talk about the feelings. It can't talk about the individuality and the context. But it's hard. It's hard to articulate flavor. So expose yourself to them. Give yourself an opportunity to make mistakes. And essentially, what I'm saying is, altogether, when you're cooking, you think of it as a learning process. And I think that, that will improve your cooking over time. And don't get scared. Don't be worried, stick your neck out. I had a wine instructor who said most important thing to me about learning about wines. This was Stephen Colpan at the Culinary Institute of America back in the early 90s. And he said, he riffed on a Duke Ellington quote, which is Duke Ellington said, if it sounds good, it is good. If you like it, you like it. And Colpan used to say, if it tastes good, it is good. You like $2 chuck. If you like something that's cheap, that's what you like. You don't like something that everyone else likes, that's okay. What's important is articulating it, understanding what it is about that. And then sharing that, maybe that broadens the opportunities of finding other foods and other sensory experiences or other people that you can, continue to learn from and create an even more enjoyable, experience.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much. I could talk to you all afternoon about this. It's so fascinating. But audience, thank you so much for joining us. Chris, again, thank you so much for joining us. Audience, if you could just kind of give us one thing at the top of the screen, there should be a QR code. Just let us know kind of how we did. We do read your feedback. Just a very, very quick survey. We'd really appreciate it. But again, thank you all for joining us. Chris, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next keynote. Have a great afternoon.
All right, take it easy.